Chapter 4. Muffled words pricked Valorian's awareness back from obscurity. Tililam. Valorian appealed. His vision began to clear from the arid white oblivion it had visited, but when he tried to open his eyes, the light seared his delicate sight. His ears still rang, but he could still discern the noises of people talking. He raised himself onto one arm, using the other hand to rub his eyes. Tililam. Valorian shouted. Please help me, I can't see. Tililam. Anybody? Valorian beckoned loudly as he sat up, using his free arm to further shade his closed eyes from the light. Glimpse by glimpse he slowly started to open his eyes, only able to look down at the ground. He grew bolder as he took a glimpse to the source of the voices. Several figures stood above him in a flux of fuzzy silhouettes. Hello. Who's there? He asked, still sheltering his vision. They ignored his presence and continued to chat amongst themselves. The ringing in Valorian's ears abated somewhat, and he was able to pick out bits of what they said. Amongst the muffles, Valorian heard. The beach over there, prevent them securing the way along, someone said, with a strange version of the common tongue. The strangeness seemed so prominent because Valorian had never heard an accent before. Having spent many thousands of years together, the elves of Cradle emulated each other's speech perfectly, each word spoken with proper pronunciation. I'll see to preparing defenses in the city. What can you bring into play if they move faster than last night? The question asked by one of the voices. It will vary. They didn't expect us last night, but they will tonight, another voice answered the first. Valorian managed to apply colors and textures to his steadily returning vision. It became clear to him that he was still in the meadow in the ring-generated fantasy world. He reached to his finger to remove the ring for good. The ring was gone. Astonished, Valorian opened both eyes. Despite the pain, he resisted the urge to close them again, his need to search for the ring, greater than the pain. Make your preparations, then get some rest. We're going to be in for another long night, one of the voices commanded. Arabine, Jonvin, stay. Valorian stopped his search at hearing the name Arabine. He forced his vision to work. Valorian blinked frantically until he was able to discern 3 human men that loomed over him. He struggled to his feet to meet their indifference head-on. If we fail to hold them tonight, they will take the city. The elves will be too late, a balding bulbous man said. He wore a full luxuriously crafted body armor, which looked as if it was meant more for show rather than use. A thin fencing sword hung from an overly embellished baldric. The sword, like the armor, was not designed for real combat. I will need the 2 of you to rally the blades. Without them, we will surely perish. Beat these brutes back to a watery grave, and you will have what you ask. As you command. Your Highness. My king, said a tall sharp-featured man with long jet-black hair and intense dark green eyes. He stood beside a slightly more muscular man. Although slightly shorter, he had a larger frame, with pale grey eyes and shoulder-length chestnut-coloured hair. They both bowed to the ostentatious aristocrat. His girth overshadowed them in the morning light. Valorian drank in the features of the last man. If there was a human half to go with the elf half of him, this was it. This was Valorian's father. Valorian was taller, but the frame was the same, his own features having adopted the chiseled characteristics present in all elves. Good, see to it. Send word to me when you're done, His Highness said as he waddled away. The 2 men, Arabine and Jonvin, remained on the crest as they watched the king mount his horse. Servants appeared to place the reins in the king's portly hands. Mounted guards in purple tunics readied themselves to ride. A golden eagle displayed on their tunics with the eagle's wings unfurled on their chests. The tunics were covered in shiny dressed tin and nickel guard braces and glossy light chain mail. They formed disorganized flanking positions, which almost seemed irrespective of the king. Plumes of dust billowed from the procession as it moved off. Foot soldiers and cavalry carried an array of fetching spears and lances that waved in the air. Tassels and banners swung widely as they swarmed towards a walled city. Valorian walked around the two men, occasionally waving his hand before them. He was about to try touching his father on the arm when Jonvin snapped around to Arabine. "This is it, Arabine. This is it." And all it took was a few thousand trolls wanting to reduce his kingdom to rubble, Jonvin said as he clapped his hand on Arabine's shoulder with affectionate zeal. The gesture richly invested with optimism as a broad smile spread from one ear to the other. Arabine waited until every single member of the royal triumph scurried through the high fortified city gates. "Let's not take stock of what we don't have, Jonvin," he said as his head shook side to side like he knew it was too good to be true. "If we manage to save the Fool's Kingdom and stay alive in the bargain, then we will toast to our earnings, eh?" Arabine raised his arm and waved a come-hither motion towards two brutish men that stood below on the plain waiting. The men appeared to be different sides to the same large and menacing coin. Casually, each began the gentle climb up the slope, with the same cumbersome manner of walking. "If I had to wait for his son to grow up as he did to release us from our fool's duty, I might allow myself to get kidnapped tonight." Jonvin joked as he began to laugh. "You shouldn't make light of the possibility," Arabine cautioned. "Trolls are disgusting creatures. If they had you in their cooking pot it wouldn't be a laughing matter," Arabine said, his censure blatant as he looked at Jonvin puzzled. "Wasn't laughing at that pleasant possibility. Just remembered that time when King Big Ass was first learning to ride a horse," Jonvin said, chuckling as he began to tell the story absent Arabine's consent. "I was teaching a class at the time when in runs this panicked stable boy screaming about an injured prince. He'd fallen off and been dragged by the horse, so naturally, I thought, with all the panic, that he'd have broken bones and such. Well, the last thing I expected to see was this big fat red rawbutt hoisted in the air with 20 or so orderlies fanning it frantically," Jonvin recounted, shaking his head from side to side whilst he laughed. Arabine looked at Jonvin, a smile began to break through the steel veneer, he released a few chuckles from his rigid countenance. "Why is it the number of orderlies always goes up every time you tell that story?" "Well, come on. Be fair, it has to go up the bigger that ass gets. Would you believe that only 2 orderlies were enough?" Jonvin asked in a lethally quick reply. Arabine looked away, pausing before he turned back towards Jonvin. Arabine's attempt to remain composed suddenly failed, and they both burst into full belly laughs. Valorian watched on as the other 2 men joined them. "Murdoff. Trox," Jonvin greeted as the men neared, a slight impish smile in his look made each of them narrow their brows suspiciously. The humour faded as serious planning began to consume their conversation. As they talked, Arabine, Murdoff, and Trox began to fade, until only Valorian and the image of Jonvin stood on the crest. The unsettled dust from the meadow vanished, and the sky dulled to a motionless portrait scene. "Hello, my son," Jonvin's image spoke directly to Valorian. Valorian did not show any astonishment that the image of his father had acknowledged him, choosing to casually look him over, rather than show any surprise. "My father was shorter than I had thought he would have been. Are you meant to guide me here? What is this place? What am I meant to do here? Why can't I see the ring anymore?" Valorian asked as he rubbed the finger where the dark gemmed ring should have been. "I can still sense it making this environment, and yet," Valorian said, his words finished as he held up his empty hand to show the ring's absence. Valorian began to scan the ground again, renewing his search for the ring. "It's not here. I know it's still on my finger in the real world, but I'm not able to see or interact with it here in this illusion. And what was the point of that lion, if that's what it was? What lesson was I to learn from it?" Valorian asked as he shrugged his shoulders. His arms and hands added agitated gestures as a means to amplify his confusion. You can't see the ring here because it's in the possession of the dominant persona. In this place, Jonvin paused, raising his arms and looking around him at the city, cliff, beach, and sky. You are not the one with the ring, so it's safe to say you are not in control. These images may be generated by the ring. Jonvin paused again to point his finger at Valorian, but this place is within your own anima psyche, and here you are a mere slave to your primitive emotions, to which the lion is the manifestation of all that primitive emotion. How do I assert myself as the dominant persona then? Valorian asked. Don't know, Jonvin responded flatly. This isn't the same as it was for me. None of this is the same. Your mother and I didn't know what to expect for sure, but we made reasoned presumptions, and I had hoped that your mother would have been there to make adjustments to the conjured animal environment as needed. My imprint had been meant to help direct you to all the irrationalities in your actions and help you see the conflicts between your subconsciousness and consciousness. But that's a futile exercise for you, because you've always been aware of the disturbances in your thoughts, so there isn't any cognitive dissonance to reconcile. So how did this environment help my father? How does consciously addressing some primitive emotion solve anything? Valorian asked successively. Dreamweaving uses the power of the unconscious mind. Over time, the mind is slowly detached from the world. The subconscious becomes the primary manipulator of reality, and your awareness, that part of you that you call yourself, slowly fades from dominance. It begins with a kind of confusion as to why you choose to do certain things. You then begin to black out, becoming lucid only to discover you've done such horrible things. The blackouts increase in frequency until they don't end. The most primitive part of your soul controls your every action, and you become the dream. Valorian listened attentively, never having heard the unraveling of this type of madness before. Valorian realized that his father would have known the details of such a thing with intimate regret. The social graces needed for patience and tolerance become forfeit to raw want, Jonvin continued, openly betraying moments of heavy-hearted recollection from his own trials. Everything turns into want. Moreover, everything becomes a matter of wanting more and more stimulation. This anima concept can help confront the unconscious mind by unifying our actions, emotions, and motivations all together within the same context, to be addressed at a cognitive level, Jonvin said as he tapped his forefinger to the side of his head. It is the ultimate form of introspection because it's able to show all your experiences in such a raw form, such a true form, without subjective filters. All the justifications we allow ourselves to accept in order to validate doing a wrong are readily revealed and exposed as falsehoods. Valorian nodded. Why does it manifest as this irrational anger with all this animalistic rage? Is that the sum total of human nature? Valorian asked, with a hint of shame for even having some human blood within his veins. The anger and rage are the most common forms, but not the only ones. We once found a blade named Palington dead for no apparent reason. There was no evidence of a fight. He was strong, right up there in the rankings, but in the end, he didn't die in some bloodthirsty rage, carving out a path of destruction. No, he died of a combination of starvation, dehydration, and exposure. It wasn't until I managed to retrace the events of his death from his fury ring that we learned that he had been completely consumed by something he had seen in a cup of tea. I even checked for poison as we found his corpse just off the road leading away from Tralestra. Still hunched over on the ground with the cup cradled in his lap. He had been utterly consumed with something his anima senses felt from the tea. Maybe the movement of the molecules, or the way it fit in with the world, but regardless, it was still the same type of blind obsession that has claimed the lives of so many dreamweavers. This is madness. What a pointless end to a life, Valorian blurted out. It's why those found to be strong at dreamweaving became known as the cursed. The more dream-weaving you are capable of doing, the faster the descent into madness, John Vin elaborated. Then what does it really matter if I escape this generated world? I'm doomed to madness anyway. It only leaves a question of whether it'll kill me alone or take everyone around me as well. Valorian exclaimed as he shook his head annoyed in thought. The frustration showed as he contemplated only those two options as a future end for himself. That doesn't matter now. This concept was designed as a means of trapping a blade's mind until that madness has been confronted and overcome. I'm sorry I can't offer any better guidance. I'm merely an anima construct, a very limited form of your father John Vine. It'll be up to you, and only you, to figure this all out and gain control yourself, John Vin confessed. Valorian swiveled his head side to side, his thoughts searching for an answer. I'm trapped here until I find a way to become the dominant persona and get that ring back from a lion. A flaming lion. The ring. It must be a symbol of authority, so once I beat the lion it should reappear, hopefully. Valorian cynically mused. He opened his mouth to speak again, but instead released the breath meant for words he could not find the need for. Valorian already knew that the questions were futile to ask. They both stood in silence. Valorian ran his gaze occasionally across the ground looking for the ring. So why did you show me that meeting? Valorian asked the imprint of John Vin. I thought it was important that you should see it. That will be the last time for many years that I genuinely laughed, John Vin said as he looked at Valorian with all the knowing of a heavy-hearted gloom. John Vin's features slowly shifted from young and virile to worn and depleted. A potent dose of that insubstantial quality of wearisome lingering rose to the surface. His blood-stained armor changed as if just washed away in a wave, the slipstream rearranged into simple bleak grey robes. He looked older than any elf Valorian had ever seen. I wanted you to see what Arabian and I began as. We were never paragons of virtue, but nor should we be thought of as just bloodthirsty monsters. We were just men, capable of doing both. It was our subconscious wants and ambitions that led us to what we became. So, the dreamweaving curse swayed them towards the bloodthirsty monsters? Valorian premised. In part yes, but if I'm to be honest, life is never made of straight paths. No one thing was truly to blame, including the curse. Part of the difficulty in regaining control from the madness is admitting that at some conscious level, you actually choose to be consumed by it so you can avoid responsibility, John Vin explained. So you still knew you were doing wrong? Valorian asked. All peoples, from dwarves to trolls, know they do wrong, but in a world where all things are some manner of wrong with little to no truly good, truly pure thing, life becomes a negotiation about the degrees of wrong. We thought we could navigate the morality of it all and find the least offensive choice. In the end, we merely traded one wrong for another like peddlers of misery, without ever understanding the real cost. Needless to say, it's a long story of an equally long descent. It might help to hear the story of it. If I can at least see how things differ from my own situation, Valorian said, but his eagerness to hear the tale was also in part to learn about his father. Very well, John Vin agreed as he walked to the edge of the precipice. With each step he seemed to sink further into deep thought as his vision fell over the edge and down to the beach below and all the history the site held. It was on this beach that something very cruel and dark opened up in us. It will be the deeds of this battle that gained us the title as the Furious Blades. What was the name of the battle? Valorian inquired. It has been known by a couple of names over the years. The last time I heard it mentioned, the woman teaching the history referred to Caposso as the kingdom under attack, John Vin answered as he turned to a cliff a mile or so away and traced his finger around the future city to be built. Caposso wasn't built for a few hundred years after this battle. How idiotic history appears to someone watching how it is written, and how even more gullible it seems when hearing that history spoken as fact. to us. It was the Battle of Clendoran's Beach. Jonvin continued his account as he turned towards the walled city. King Edan Clendoran was the original creator of the Furious Blades. He lived a long life with us to rejuvenate him, but then he died suddenly before releasing us from our oaths. We were left sworn to his heir. As you've already seen, Prince Nomen was one presence that could truly fill a room. So the father was different from Nomen then? Valorian asked. Like chalk and cheese, Jonvin answered almost immediately. King Edan Clendoran had travelled afar as a young man. He travelled to remote lands far across the sea and returned from an ordeal that only a handful had been able to come back from. And there was elves and dwarves on that convoy, if that gives you some sort of a hint to his worth. They also brought back the Kakir-Thueli. Valorian inhaled quickly, drawing in enough breath to ask a spate of questions about the enigmatic race, which few amongst the elves had ever gained much if any, first-hand experience with. Jonvin's hand came up to halt Valorian's questions before they had a chance to find a voice. Don't ask me much about them, for I know little enough, Jonvin proclaimed, predicting the mind of the son that held such similarities to the mind of Jonvin's wife Mile. Valorian nodded with a familiar disappointment to rarely getting the satisfaction of an answer. What I can say, is they were an odd bunch. Always wore long robes and veils. I couldn't even tell you for sure if they had arms or legs, never even spoke, only communicated by linking minds. Jonvin offered to then shrug his shoulders. Valorian nodded again. It was more of an answer than any Ilias had been able to give. Now, King Edan Clendoran, as a returning prince then, took his father's throne in time. He changed the kingdom in many ways. Brought all the fair laws, engineering marvels, and clever ways of doing things to the kingdom. Everything he had learned from his travels. He made the kingdom prosperous, and all the people loved him for it, Jonvin emphasized. And was he a dream weaver? Valorian asked. No, King Edan was just a truly good king. And back then things weren't quite that simple as either or. The presence of the Kakir-Thueli had changed something in men, or perhaps they'd just awoken it. Magic was suddenly within men for the first time. But, it wasn't equal amongst all. Many humans developed the ability to direct a very crude form of animus, the very rawest mix of elemental energies. It allowed them to power simple devices and even highly destructive weapons. They became known as mages. Others developed a variation of anima, but this simple attribute allowed them to direct stored elemental animus energy very effectively. They became known as sorcerers. Using stored energy collected from the mages, they could form powerful magic. They built hundreds of devices, actually, thousands is probably a more accurate count. The devices allowed them to practice magic as proficiently as any dream weaver. They couldn't dilate their temporal constant, but everything else they could do with their wands, staffs, amulets, and all. Are the designs of those devices stored here, in the ring? Valorian asked. Yes, Jonvin replied as he nodded his head. Show me them please, Valorian requested. I can't. This anima concept is highly restrictive. I'm unable to access the Fury Ring's matrix. Figure out how to overcome this anima concept, and you'll have access to my entire stored library. I stored optics of everything I encountered of worth. Entire libraries, inventors' laboratories, fighting techniques, and all the sorcery and mage devices I ever found, Jonvin said with his expression beaming with the price of the knowledge to be discovered. So, what about the mages and sorcerers? Do they go mad also? Valorian asked, suddenly curious if they also suffered the fate of dream weavers. No. Well, not like the blades anyway. By using their devices, the madness never creeps in on them, but they do well enough at being the usual type of crazy. I've met plenty you could call mad, but just of a conventional sort of madness. All the ones in charge of the blessed hegemony are a bunch of sociopaths and psychopaths, John Vin said in a terse accounting. And was it Glendoran who established the blessed hegemony? The history books in Ilias always make reference to them in association with ruling governments, but never clarify any beginnings, Valorian inquired, seeking clarification to an old unanswered question. No, that all came later. Glendoran only had an eye for dreamweavers and progress in the beginning. He was never much of a politician, preferred to build rather than talk about all the whys and wherefores. So he needed those with magic and began to search the entire kingdom for people with the talent for dream weaving. The Kakir-Thueli folk helped him and were always by his side. It was an odd relationship, John Vin explained. This is the land you came from? Valorian asked the question as he looked at the soil to see some of himself in the earth. No, we came from a place I was too young to even know the name of. Did most of my growing on the road. I was an orphan when they found me and give me the test. There was me, working as a scribe's assistant for a big merchant's office. A lot like you, my boy, I lost my family young. Your grandfather had accepted a job as a scribe at a merchant's shipping office, and I was all that survived the journey here. I was educated enough to be educated more, so the owner's wife took some mighty sort pity on me, John Vin confided. Valorian knew that manner of pity all too well, for the elves had given him it freely. The Kakir-Thueli's tests were swift and without ceremony. That very night I found myself sleeping in the same room as my new big brother Arabine, in Glendoran's palace itself. It became apparent early on, that the abilities of the Kakir-Thueli didn't work the same way with humans. They could make it appear as if they were changing the reality around them, but we could actually make it permanent. Their mental abilities were superb. They could implant memories in unconditioned minds, and retrieve memories from those same minds. Even when the person had long forgotten such things. They read thoughts as we read day and night. A dream weaver can dream cast into a person's mind, but they couldn't help but do it. Thought was more real to them than anything they could walk on or hold in their hands. If they had hands, that is. I've read some records that give mention of them, but much like your own knowledge of them, the information is all rumors of hearsay. So they could only make illusions? Valorian surmised. Not in the way you're thinking. It wasn't just imagined things and pretty spectacle. May I remind you that you're in an illusion now? And the effects, as you should recall, can deliver quite a real pain, John Vin said, clarifying the distinction. Valorian shivered slightly, the lion's attack on him easy to recall. King Edan saw the potential in a group of men who could effect such magical change in their surroundings. We had always been dependent on elves and dwarves to perform magical actions for us and make magical items. Dwarves with the dwarf song magic made all of the finest buildings and facilities. Any items of refinement, or scholarly need, came from ridiculously long petitioning to elitist elfin service guilds. Both races could seek whatever price they would choose for the service. Many things they wouldn't help with at all, neither race wanting to place within humans too high a dependency on them. So, we began facilitating the king's more elaborate innovations throughout the city, the ones that he would normally have had to send formal invitations to either elves or dwarves to get done. The changeover from glorified workers to the king's elite force happened on an occasion when we had accompanied the king and his escort. He wanted a series of new mechanized flour mills to be made, John Vin explained, pointing towards the emergence of a water outlet before he traced his finger to show the course of the man-made water channel that ran from the river to the sea. John Vin's finger paused, aiming at the flour mill's location. The king always liked to find mechanized ways to do things, so he brought us with him to explain what he wanted and where. He was giving us directions on what needed building, when a force of bandits set upon our small party. The royal escort would have been overwhelmed if Arabine and I hadn't been there to defend them. We had been growing in strength and ability far faster than the others had. The escort of soldiers encircled the king and his advisors, as they all watched us flick the pesky bandits away with ease. The following day the king began construction of a separate training ground for us, along with petitions with vast amounts of expensive trade to the elves for sword instructors normally reserved for nobility. Arabian and I were made knights and given rank amongst his military. We began recruiting those from our previous ranks trained by the Kakir-Thueli. The name Clendoran's Mystic Knights were given to us to so fear in Clendoran's enemies, but the name that stuck was simply the Blades. After learning the elfin sword styles, Arabian quickly developed his own style of liquid blade, and the sight of a transcendent sword creating wave after wave of metallic ribbons was unforgettable and most identifying. We were Blades, the Blades. What happened to the Kakir-Thueli? Valorian inquired. Yet more enigma were those fellas. When we went to sleep, they were there, and when we woke, they were gone. Nobody saw them leave, with nary a trace of them leaving by land or sea, Jonvin explained, divulging all he knew. Valorian found himself growing quite comfortable around this imprint of his father. I'm assuming that since you survived, you won the battle and earned your release from his son's service? Valorian presumed. Not exactly. Life is a cruel teacher, as the saying goes. First, there's a test, and if you survive, then you get your lesson. Come see, Jonvin said, stepping to the edge and motioning Valorian to follow. The ring-generated world shuddered in rushing surges of movement. The landscape shifted forward through time. In the sky, clouds that zipped by in a raging rush of progression dimmed to the inky darkness of night. Men materialized around Valorian and Jonvin as dark ships appeared on the horizon over the glassy shadowy waters. Valorian enhanced his vision with elfin clarity, narrowing his eyes on the ships far away. Thousands of bulky, poorly maintained ships ran the length of the skyline. They all had different configurations, with no two the same style. It was a fleet put together with no care or love for sailing.